Hello, it's Miss Saxon in the library, and today I want to do something called First Chapter Fridays. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to randomly pick a book off the shelf, and I'm going to read just the first chapter. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I think there's a lot of great books that don't get checked out in the library. And you can't really know if you're going to like something until you read a little bit of it. And, sometimes you read something and you decide you don't like it. And that is totally fine. Miss Saxon reads things and she doesn't always like them. But I think sometimes if you give it a chance, it actually will connect with you. And so this one kind of caught my eye. It's called A Whale in Paris. Now, I've never been to Paris, but I don't think Paris is known for whales. And when I look at the back of the book, so the very first sentence on the back cover says, "Ever since the Germans became unwelcome guests of Paris, Chantal and Papa have fished for their dinner in the Seine River." So right there, I know that this is going to be a historical story because the Germans would have been in Paris during World War II. And they were definitely not guests. At that time, they would have been occupying Paris. And so if you like history, right there you might think, ooh, maybe this is something I like. So let's try the first chapter. If we don't like it, no big deal. If you like it, come and get it from the library. So it starts off, the first chapter is called The Sounds of Salmon. An outlandish thrum. The year was 1944, and the Germans had been the guest of Paris for nearly 4 years. Well, not guest exactly. That's what Papa called them. Chantal Dupré knew well better to take her father's words seriously. After all, fathers use humor to hide the truth, or spare your feelings, or avoid difficult questions, or to cheer you up. At least her father did. Now, the night was June 3rd, 2 weeks after her 12th birthday, and Chantal was sitting in the dark. Beside Papa on the river's embankment, a fishing rod was in her hand. Ever since the Germans became the guest of Paris, she and her Papa had gone out after sunset to fish for salmon, winter or spring, at least 3 nights a week. Papa was a fishmonger. Before the war, fresh fish arrived by bucketful on trains and trucks from Normandy. The Dupré market was always full. Now, under the German occupation, they had to catch fish themselves. Chantal stared at her unflinching line, the stubborn bobber floating on the surface. "Go on, fish, bite! Bite, I tell you!" She willed her bobber to sink, or even just quiver, but it wasn't working. No matter how much muscle she poured into her will, there was no ripple or movement or luck. That night was still and stretching. As usual, Chantal and Papa didn't talk. They sat quietly side by side, wrapped up in their own minds. In her mind was Mama, patiently teaching Chantal a new chord on the ukulele. But what Papa was thinking was anyone's guess. But she assumed that her mother made an appearance in his mind, too. The bells of Notre Dame chimed the hour, midnight. "Time to fill the bucket," Papa said. "But we haven't caught any fish yet." "They need to know the bucket is full, and then they'll come." Chantal made her skeptical face. Papa always did this, sending her to the river's edge. "A smart girl like you shouldn't fear the water," he often told her. Papa didn't understand about the water and how it called to her in a sweet voice, a voice in her mind. Chantal never feared falling in. She feared that once she was in the water, she wouldn't want to leave it again. It was in the water that Mama waited. Chantal picked up the steel bucket and climbed down the sloping embankment. With the moon hiding behind a cloud, the Seine was practically black, prickling only with occasional torchlight from other anglers farther down the opposite side of the river. The water was low this time of year. It hadn't rained much in April and May. Chantal wondered whether that was the reason they weren't catching any fish. Are there fewer salmon in the river when the water is low? Are the fish less likely to bite? Chantal tied her rope to the bucket and lowered it into the river. careful not to clang against the stone or scare any potential fish away. She also made sure not to let the bucket sink too deeply, for if it did, the current would catch it and the heavy bucket would be difficult to haul up. The moon emerged. She could make out the shapes of the roofs on the other side of the river. The windows of the houses were all dark because of the night patrols. Before the war, Paris had been known as the City of Lights. Now, all the street lamps were off. All the windows were blocked by curtains that had once been rugs or blankets. The bucket filled with water and more water until it was time to reel it in. Just as she pulled the rope, she heard a deep rumbling sound come from the water, a low thrum smudging the silence. Her chest chilled as if she just swallowed a chunk of ice. This wasn't Mama's voice, the sweet voice Chantal usually heard in her mind. This voice was completely different. All of her concentrated on listening. Growth echoed off the stone walls built high on the Seine. The sound vibrated every nerve in her body. Who's there? The sound came again. Growth! A outlandish flum so intense that it created a hole inside of her. Frightened, she let the rope slip. The bucket plunged deep into the water and began traveling downstream. Oh no. Chantal held onto the rope and gave it a tentative tug. Nothing. She yanked and strained. The bucket wouldn't budge. Finally, she fastened the end of her rope to a metal cleat used to moor boats. The rope went taut and shivered with tension. Intrigued, Chantal plucked the rope, and it gave off a low note like the bass string of Mama's ukulele. Grow! Went the low sound again in the water, as though in reply. Impossible, she thought, squinting in the dark. She plucked the rope twice. Grow! Grow! Went the sound, broadening and deepening the stone embankments. Where are the noises coming from? Chantal plucked the rope 3 times. Grow! 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 She smiled. The sound came from the darkness, had a deep, friendly tone. Not the voice of a monster. There seemed to be goodwill in it. What could it be? 4 plucks. Grow! 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 Chantal's smile changed to laughter. Whatever was out there obviously had a sense of humor. It laughed along with her until it faded and slurped away when another sound came, a much more upsetting sound. Chomp! Blook! Chomp! Blook! The clunk of heavy boots on cobblestones. Chantal looked in alarm. 2 dark shapes approached, German soldiers making their rounds. She felt her throat tighten in fear. Papa! She scrambled up the embankment and found him dozing, his face drawn tight around his bones. How defenseless he looked in the dark, with his thin lips and stubbly chin. How different from the daytime Papa she knew, the broad-backed man who cooked and cracked jokes. She shook him awake. What? He sat up. Chantal pointed to the direction of the soldiers. The Nazi helmets were black and too dull to reflect the moonlight. Tall rifles swung with each clunking step. Dread on 4 legs. Shlump, block, shlump, block, shlump, block. Papa climbed to his feet and waited beside Chantal. Seconds dripped past. They all had the permits they needed to be out on their curfew. They were allowed to fish at night to provide for the city, and yet she seized his hand. If the soldiers recognized them, all would be fine. If the uniformed men were new recruits and felt like making trouble, Chantal and Papa would have to show their papers and answer all sorts of rude questions. What are you doing here? Who signed this permit for you? Why is your daughter not in bed? Where's her mother? The last question was the trickiest. Chantal could answer it, but she preferred not to. She hoped the Germans would ask anything else, because whatever couldn't answer the questions quick enough risked being arrested or worse. She heard the stories. So many people imprisoned, sent away, shot. Chantal closed her eyes and wished for the soldiers to be gone. Despite how much she hated them or lived in defiance of their presence, this was the way of the world now. Occupation. War. There was no avoiding these guests. She opened her eyes again, and her stomach clenched. The two soldiers were only a stone's throw away. The shorter one nodded like a gentleman and said, "Bonsoir, monsieur. Bonsoir, mademoiselle." "Good evening, sir. Good evening, miss." "Guten Abend, Herr Lieutenant," Papa replied. This was a game they played. The Germans pretended they belonged in Paris and spoke French to show their good intentions. The Parisians, however, pretended to accept their fate and spoke German to show their contempt. Chantal released a deep breath after the soldiers passed, but she didn't let go of Papa's hand until the echo of their boots had died away. All right, so that's the first chapter. What do we think? Thumbs up, thumbs down, maybe? It sounds like an interesting story, and I always like sort of twist on history or learning about history from a different point of view. So maybe you'd like it, maybe you wouldn't. All right, thank you.